Okay, so welcome to my talk. We're going to start off with a very brief exercise. I need you to pay attention to me, so follow along. No. So the whole point of that exercise, the whole point of that is to give you an idea of what it's like to not have access to the information that you're trying to get. You came to this talk and you said, oh, I'm going to learn something about accessibility. But I started off using American Sign Language, how many Americans are there in the room? Right. How many of you speak sign language at all anyway? Right. Yeah, maybe, okay, yeah, a little bit of familiarity. But I went fast because I'm fluent in American Sign Language. I can communicate with deaf people without any kind of problem. In most cultures, there's some differences in language, and we'll get into that. But the idea is, I was trying to give you information. You did not have the faculties with which to process that information. So let's try starting this again. Hi, my name's PJ. I work at a company called DevRelate.io. We do developer and community relations as a service. I'm here on behalf of my client, Humio. They do logging, monitoring, observability. Really cool company. I also work with Tito, which is a great ticketing agency. OSMI, this is PHP. I'm sure you've heard of OSMI, and if you haven't, please go check them out. And HiPi, which is a wonderful business-to-business application launching platform. So the first thing you saw, this is important, but it's not what the talk's about. So the first thing you saw was this. So for those of you who don't speak sign language, which is all of you, these are my in-laws. This is Bill and Lena. They took a trip a few years ago to Egypt. I said, I'm doing a talk about accessibility. I want to specifically talk about some issues that people in the deaf community have. What picture would you like me to use? And they were like, oh, the one from the pyramids, of course. I'm like, this doesn't even make sense. We're from Buffalo, New York. Where's the snow? Where's the people driving off the side of the road? But so they're really great people. They met at the Deaf Olympics in the 1960s. It's a wonderful story, but that's not the story we're here for. If you want to ask me afterwards, I will tell you. My wife would be so happy to have her parents' story shared. But they're awesome people. But the reason why I bring them up is not because of their awesome story. It's more because when I started to code things, I realized there's a certain group of people you have to think about it. And these are the people I think about. When I write code, I try to think about people who aren't me. And a lot of people, when I've done this talk before, have said, why are you focusing on a septuagenarian couple? They're in their 70s. They barely understand how to connect a digital camera, why they even have one, I don't know, to a USB port. Isn't our focused target audience when we build tech 16 to 35-year-olds? No, it's not, or at least it shouldn't be. We kind of have this idea that everyone's like us. Everything's similar, so we're all on an even playing field, and that's not true. And I want to say, before we really get into this talk, I'm not trying to act like I'm holier than thou or that I have some kind of special knowledge. I'm not super woke, as the kids say these days. The idea here is that unless something has touched your life, unless you have an understanding of it somewhere in your life, you're probably not going to have it affect your day-to-day coding cycle. So this shot is a tweet that was from back in November from a friend of mine who's a wonderful, amazing coder and mentor. Actually got me started speaking, tricked me into it. That's a whole other great story. And this is from November of 2018. And he was in an airport and he saw someone using FaceTime, deaf people using FaceTime to communicate with each other. He's like, I never thought of that part of the application. And my first thought when I saw the tweet was like, funny thing, neither did Apple. But at the same time, neither video chat nor deaf people using video chat for that purpose was a new concept in November of 2018. This is not a brand new thing for them. It's just something that we as hearing people don't think about it. And yet this person had never once thought about it. Never once. Until they saw it. We like to think that we're used to understanding accessibility because of the everyday things we experience. But at the same time, we can't even use the right names for things. This is another great tweet. This is a discussion between two developers talking about captions. Note the complete lack of the word captions. They use the word subtitles. Does anyone know the difference between subtitles and captions? Subtitles are when you're watching a film or a TV show or something and it's in a language that you don't speak. So there's subtitles at the bottom in a language that you do speak, word for word explaining what the dialogue is. Captions aren't quite like that. They kind of get the general gist, especially with live television, a sporting event. They get most of the ideas across, but they are in real time. And they are often auto-fed, and they're often not that good. That's part of what we're going to talk about with accessibility. On another note, if you want to learn more about deaf people and deaf culture, there's this guy, his name's Niall DeMarco. He's awesome. You should follow him on Twitter. Niall was born deaf, grew up in a deaf family, 25 people, every single one of them is deaf. He advocates for the needs of deaf people. He says that his goal is to reach the needs of 7 million deaf people around the world with the platform that he has. He was a model, and he was a very famous model. I mean, obviously, he's a good-looking man. I would, if I could pay money to figure out how to look like that, I would not look like this. But he rose to fame because he used his platform and he wanted to reach out to as many people. And the place that he got most famous was, of all places, Dancing with the Stars. It's an American television show where if you're a star, I'm using that word very liberally, you can go on and you're matched with a dance partner. So this guy's deaf, and yet he managed to win the show. And they said, what are you going to do with the money? He's like, well, I'm giving that all away. That's going to deaf awareness. That's going to deaf schools. That's going to deaf kids with needs. And to me, that was amazing. But he's fun to follow. He's got a great positive outlook, wicked sense of humor, lots of good videos. But you can learn a lot about deaf culture from this man because he's promoting the whole idea. So back to the name idea. So these names for things, like captioning versus subtitles, may not seem important to you. But vocabulary in communities where accessibility is an issue, these things are crucial. Here we have another great example. Can anyone tell me the difference between these two pictures? Can anyone tell me the difference between what the woman all the way to the left is doing compared to the woman in the middle in this picture? Do you know the difference?
I think they're both translated.
You're exactly wrong.
Okay.
So, I'm not picking on you. Here's the thing, and a lot of people say this, and I know this part of the culture I know because my wife does this job. She does not do this job. This is a sign language interpreter. Her job is to voice everything the deaf person says and sign everything that, in this case, the doctor, whoever they're interacting with, what they say. This is someone in real life. In the US, it's actually required by law. If you're going to interact with someone at a business, not a business, but like a doctor, a lawyer, a police officer, they are required to bring in an interpreter for a deaf person. They will fight you tooth and nail because it's also on the government's, their job to pay for it. And of course, they don't want to. They're the government. They don't want to pay for anything. Have you been to America? Anyway, so the interesting thing here is this woman is not signing word for word what the doctor is saying. She's using ASL. If you notice, when I got to the side of my in-laws, clearly I said a lot more words than I signed when I told the story in sign language. And that's because ASL doesn't match up to English exactly. It has different grammar, different structure. It's about getting the idea across and not adding every single word that's there. This woman on the right is a translator. Interpreter, translator. What she's doing is taking everything this person is saying word for word, translating into another language for this woman over here all the way on the right. So that's the difference. She's saying everything word for word. It's kind of like a subtitle versus a caption. This is captioning, getting the idea across. This is translating, giving you every single word that's being said just in a different language.
Yeah, that's where I went wrong. In Dutch, words the same.
Okay, that's fair. But I actually do know a couple Dutch interpreters who would disagree with you. Yeah, it's a very fine point, especially not in English, but that's the language I speak mostly, so I don't speak Dutch. I'm sorry. If I could, I'd learn every language there is. But back to our talk. So we're here to focus on technology. And there were some examples we talked about earlier, video chat, FaceTime, captions, that are excellent examples of assistive technology. And all of those are more or less software-based. But there's also some things, unlike interpreters, that are hardware-based. This is actually a job that my wife did for a while called video relay service. And the actual idea is you can be a deaf person, you can call another deaf person, video chat. But on your TV, like you don't even need to like find your phone or your iPad or whatever. Or if you need to like call your phone company, you can call this person and they will do the same thing an interpreter would do live. And they actually act out and voice your emotions and everything. Like if you're angry, the interpreter is angry. This person on the other end of the line knows you're pretty fucking angry. They make it very clear. before this became a thing, before FaceTime, before video chat, before video relay, a deaf person had to rely on a thing called a TTY. Does everyone know what a TTY is? You know what a TTY is. It's a little nightmare of a modem with a keyboard attached to it. And it is a one-at-a-time form of communication that had very strict protocols. Like when you finished something, you had to say GA, and that meant go ahead. I'm done speaking, it's now your turn. Only one person could speak at a time. If you had to talk from TTY to TTY, a conversation just about like, hey, let's meet up and go for coffee. Sounds good. What time do you want to go? Let's go at 9. I don't want to go too late. I don't want to have too much caffeine later in the day. Cool. Where will we meet? Oh, we'll meet at your house and I'll drive. Great. That is a conversation that I just had in what, like 25 seconds? On a TTY, that is like a half hour. And you're depending on whether the person is like really good at typing or not, or if they're, of an age where they don't have arthritis and they can type. So take that, and then they had TTY interpreters who could barely read, had no emotion in their voices, and these are the people you're relying on to call to make a doctor appointment for you. TTYs were horrible. Luckily, we've been able to get some hardware that fixes that. But we focus on web applications and mobile applications. What are the things that we forget about? What are we missing when we start to build the things that we do that these hardware things fix, but we could also fix in the websites we build? So let's get down to the basics. When we first start considering issues of accessibility, the first thing people really got concerned with was people who are sight impaired, blind or other sight issues. And oddly, there was this solution that was already built in when we were just doing things with HTML. There's this great concept of alt text. There's a great product I'll talk more about later called JAWS. And JAWS is what they call a sight reader. And it will run through a site and it will read to a blind person everything that's going on that site. This will become more important as we talk more later. One of the first things that it picked up on was alt text. So luckily they're already doing this, so that's wonderful, but unfortunately we have modern things where we're using frameworks and we're using different things to dynamically generate HTML, which is great for us as coders, but not all frameworks automatically generate alt tags, or if they do, sometimes they're just blank and we're still responsible to go and fill them in. So these levels of abstraction have actually made it more difficult for us to make accessible web applications. So there's some tips to adding your alt tags. The first tip is to make it meaningful. So I want everybody to close your eyes for a second. We're going to do another exercise. Everybody close your eyes. I'm going to give you a description of the same thing twice in a different way. So this is description number 1, a picture of the ocean. Does everybody have that in their mind? Cool. Here's description number 2. The ocean with rolling waves crashing over one another, the sun high overhead, and a seagull in the distance hovering over the waves. You can open your eyes now. One of those descriptions had value. The other did not. Adding longer alt text that fully describes what the picture adds to the page, the site, the application, whatever it is super important. If you can't come up with descriptive text, your step is to ask yourself, is this image necessary? Do I need it? If the image alt text is like spacer.1.gif, spacer.6.jpg, do you need that? Does it add value to the page, or are you just doing it because it looks prettier to you? Try to avoid things like graphic of, diagram of, image of. They're not helpful. This is another thing that seems to make life easier for folks with no sight impairment whatsoever, and it's also super basic, and we should be doing it anyway. Label your form fields. Beyond the design aspect, it looks nice to your users. To the people who can't see, actually labeling form fields tells them what the field is for. It lets them know. If you don't have labels on your form fields, it could just get thrown away. In this case, like a lot of modern languages, PHP included, I work in a lot of different languages, so it's not really PHP specific all the time. But they allow this by default. They automatically say, okay, you've got a form field. What do you want to put in it? And the abstraction layers actually are helpful in this case where they're not so much with the alt text. Why that's true in form fields and not in images, I couldn't tell you. We may never know. Additionally, and this is just kind of a pro tip, any field that has a credit card involved, you're taking credit card information, label the form field, and it's not hard to have a drop-in that will automatically detect by the first 4 digits of entering a card what type of card it is, so you're not making anyone sight impaired, deaf, whatever, pick which kind of card they have. You're just wasting time with that. In this modern day and age, like you really don't need to do that. This is just good design now. This isn't necessarily accessibility, but it helps with accessibility because drop boxes and pick lists for sight readers are the worst. It's not clear. It could just be that this is a static text list that they're looking through. It could be that this is a list where they're supposed to select something from. It's not clear in JAWS. And JAWS is like a fairly standard thing. A lot of people use it, and it's a fairly beefy piece of equipment. So it's not like, this is something they haven't thought of. It's just we need to be better at what we do. So try to avoid these things if you can. Give button elements inner text, or if it absolutely 100% needs to be a graphic because that's what your design people want, label it properly with alt text that corresponds to what the button actually does. So you have some examples. Submit is actually a really shitty thing to put on a website. It doesn't mean anything. It's not clear. Create account, subscribe now, send message, register free. That makes it clear, like, oh, I'm starting up an account. I'm making something new. Submit could be like, oh, am I submitting a form? Am I submitting my information? Am I paying right now? What exactly am I doing? So make these things clear. Similar to the form elements, this benefits non-sighted people as well. Some of the basic needs of accessibility, oddly enough, fall over into better use, better UI, better UX strategies. Radio buttons need labeling too. Don't leave them out. Just because it has a visual text component doesn't mean that you know which button corresponds with which text component. So the button itself needs to have a field set element in HTML to label the group of choices and make it clear that it's a radio button, you're picking one thing. Same logic here. Make it easier for people to understand what they are interacting with. Fonts. Now I know we're all internet savvy. We would all love to make all of our websites in Comic Sans. Am I right? No? You're shaking your head no. Papyrus? Wingdings. Do I have it? No, okay. Obviously, the thing here is there's a big world of difference in what font you use. Serifed fonts are really bad for people with sight impairments. That's just one aspect. Now, there's another thing altogether called dyslexia. Dyslexia is when your mind changes letters and moves them around. People who are dyslexic who use serif fonts have an extremely hard time establishing one letter from another or its position. Generally, this is actually the reason why most HTML work, most websites, most frameworks automatically revert to Helvetica and Arial because they are the most site-specific, easy to read fonts. They're sans serif, they are clear, and people who are dyslexic or people who are sight impaired can clearly see what the letters are. As far as the screen readers, it makes no difference. They can read it either way. But for people who are dyslexic, that's terrible. For people who are deaf, who are reading the content and not really bring it in, serif fonts aren't that great because they start to mix together. When you're hard of hearing, you're reading a lot. So it's very key to make your fonts as clear and visible as possible. So another basic thing, or seemingly basic, captioning is not always a simple process. It can be difficult. There's many services out there, and luckily there's cool events like this that have live captioning of some of the talks, and that's awesome. It's becoming more and more popular and less expensive, which is great. Excuse me, but there's also a lot of video out there that we put on our websites about tutorials and walkthroughs and about pages, and find out why we're so cool. Come work here, and here's a video about how cool it is. We got beer pong and shit. I don't really get into that stuff, but some people like it. Making captions doesn't only aid the hard of hearing. Again, people with dyslexia, part of what helps them develop, better reading skills is keeping the captions on, reading things through captions. A lot of people take in more when they're reading the content instead of just hearing the content. When I first started looking at accessibility, one of the biggest blockers was JavaScript. 10 years ago, if you wanted to make, in the US, what they called an accessible site, you had to follow the Americans with Disabilities Act compliance site. And that meant cutting your JavaScript down to nearly zero because none of it was compliant. These days, modern JavaScript is accessible. Each flavor has different protocols, and some are more accessible than others. But Node.js is very solid, Vue.js is very solid. Just be aware of the pros and cons of the JavaScript you're using when you add it to a site. Keep it to a minimum. Screen readers get hung up on things like JavaScript, especially if it takes your page long to load and just the JavaScript loads and you're waiting for the actual real content. And listen, I get it. This is a PHP conference, and I'm talking about JavaScript. But let's be honest with ourselves just for a moment. If we could do this just for a moment together, like a family. If you're working on the internet at all, you're working with JavaScript. We are. That's just the way it is. Even if you don't touch it on a day-to-day, someone on your team does. Some part of your site is in JavaScript. It's unavoidable. It's ubiquitous. And we should actually be happy about this because JavaScript has come such a long way from like that vanilla JavaScript or like that jQuery nonsense back in the day. But believe me, there's JavaScript somewhere in your application, unless you're backend only, which is crazy. So that's the thing I want to talk about is knowing your audience. Like, how do you find out when you need to worry about accessibility? Quick tip, you already need to worry about accessibility. I actually use this picture. This is one of my favorite pictures. So I'm not a tall guy, especially not by standards in the Netherlands. And I went to a concert this summer with like this band. I really wanted to see them. I was super excited, and I like had pretty close seats, and it's great. And these people kept their hands up in front of me the entire time. The band's behind those hands. I know they're there because I can hear them. But yeah, so I didn't have accessibility. So we focused on a lot of the basics for the sight impaired. Our media, the internet, is essentially a visual media, and this has always been the case. But visually impaired people aren't just blind people, and that's what we need to keep in mind. In the same way that saying hard of hearing doesn't mean 100% unable to hear, 100% deaf. There are grades to these things, so you have to be aware of these things when you're thinking about the users you're working with. YouTube is an excellent example. Most visually impaired folks are never going to go to YouTube to find content. Why would they? I mean, think about it. It's kind of a shit show. The site's too busy. Just go to youtube.com sometime. Just look at what's popping up on the screen as it loads. It's like so much garbage. Imagine a screen reader trying to get to all that to see what the first video that you've watched over and over again, you know, of like goats, baby goats playing in pajamas. It's a great video. There's all this stuff before you would ever get there with a screen reader. It would take you like 5 minutes to read through the rest of the stuff before you got to your goats in pajamas. So a lot of people don't do. They're getting better at this. They're actually making better things for YouTube for people who are visually impaired. The negative side, they're putting it behind a paywall because they want everyone to be on YouTube TV now. Because I already have Hulu and Netflix and Amazon Prime, so I need another streaming service. On the other hand, about 3-4 years ago, YouTube started to get pretty strict about captioning. They're like, hey, we're going to make captions, and we're going to try to do them through AI. That didn't work so well. But deaf people were like, holy crap, I can probably watch all these wacky videos that everybody's been telling me about and posting on Facebook and actually understand what's going on. It actually is funny when that man falls down the stairs. Let's watch it again. What's the situation? I have context. This is great. So, you know, that's around the time that a lot of the other services like Netflix and Hulu and Amazon Prime are like, oh, we should get into captions. And listen, I've seen the pictures. I know exactly how well documented Netflix's captioning issues are, where like you see people who are like, there's an image of My Little Pony at the bottom. It says like kill, 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 because it's picking up the captions from a Quentin Tarantino movie. We're not all perfect. That's why we continue to make software. We're never done. But still, the fact that they even made an effort is pretty impressive. It made the world open up. My in-laws, for example, were not able to watch Netflix for the first 3, 4, 5 years that Netflix was around because there was no captions. There was no way to look at it. And they don't want to watch a movie and not know what the hell anybody's saying. That's boring. The next time, like, if you really want to experience this, find a 5-minute YouTube video, cut the sound, turn off the captions, make it full screen. You will lose interest in about a minute or two. That's what it's like to watch a movie for them. They don't go to the theater. There's no captions at the theater. That tech is slowly coming along where they have goggles that have like this weird like 3D text at the bottom, but those aren't great. But it's getting better. And it's actually the internet applications that are pushing it. So sight is kind of important when it comes to a visual medium. But there's a whole other category of blindness you need to be aware of. How many people can tell me what number is in this image? Just don't say it, just raise your hand. I have at least one person, 2 people who are not, 3 people not confident enough to tell me that number is 74. Color blindness, or color vision deficiency, or CVD, affects 1 in 12 men, or about 8% of the entire world population, and 1 in 200 women, or about 0.5% of the world population. And there's different degrees to color blindness. Like there's different types. There's red-green colorblind. And if you are red-green, if you're one of the people who didn't raise your hand and couldn't tell me what number that was, you may want to see someone. You might have a slight amount of red-green color blindness. Why is that important? Because it's how stoplight works. It's how it's how to let you know whether you can cross the road and not get hit by a million bikes coming by. Like, these things are kind of important. Why did they make red, green, those colors? I don't know. But if you build an application and it's in red and green, your application might not be accessible to someone who's colorblind. And if they can't access it, if you have like red text on a green background, they're going to see white or like a grayish, kind of shitty grayish color. You're going to lose your audience. Less of an accessibility issue and more of a don't annoy the entire internet issue. Let's see if this actually plays. Is it going? Yeah. So less of an accessibility issue, more of a don't annoy the entire internet issue is don't automatically run a video with no captioning and the sound cranked way up every time it plays, every time someone hits your site. Just don't do that. And if all of you can share this with every news agency in the world, from the BBC to the Washington Post to the Nippon News in Japan, like anywhere you go, every time you click on one of those sites, it's like, hey, do you suffer from mesothelioma? It's like, I don't need this video right now. I don't even want to hear it. I want to read this article. Why are you playing me a video? No one needs this. Not the advertiser using it, not the end user annoyed by it. No one. Avoid automatically playing videos at all costs. This isn't just a web issue either. I know that PHP is a mostly web-focused language, but I mean, we all have to have mobile versions of our applications these days. Allowing for things like pinch to zoom for someone who's sight impaired, their ability to pick up their phone and go like this so they can actually see what's going on when they're looking at Twitter and be able to read it, super important. That doesn't come for free. It doesn't happen automatically. Additionally, more mobile devices means better access to the world in general. I have this statistic in another talk, and I don't have it written here. Something along the lines of there are 70 million active cell phones anywhere in the world at any given time. There are only 2.5 million people. 2.5 million people in the world who don't have an active flushing toilet, but they probably have a mobile phone. So think about that for a minute. We may have screwed up our priorities there, but like we talked about with the deaf people, FaceTime was such a huge change for them. Having a mobile device where they could whip something out of their pocket and talk to one of their friends, like, holy crap, that's amazing. No more TTY. My wife and her mother communicate daily. And that was something that they weren't able to do. Before, you had to do a lot of different things. And I'll give you another example using my mother-in-law. She's from Sweden. She was actually born in Jakobstad, Finland, but grew up in Stockholm. Long before the advent of FaceTime. And she has a brother who still lives in Stockholm. If they wanted to communicate, they had to send a letter, which could take 2 weeks. They had to fax when that technology came over, and that was expensive, so you're like, happy birthday. Or wait for them to be in the same place at the same time, which was pretty rare because it's not exactly easy for either of them to travel at any given time. Then one day, FaceTime. Video relay, they can talk to each other every single day. Their lives are now more accessible. They've grown so much closer in their older age because they're able to communicate. I mean, my mother-in-law moved to the United States in 1967 and talked to her brother maybe on a monthly basis via letter while she was here until 2010, more or less. Think about what a crazy change in your life that is. And it's just gotten better and better over the years. So how do we check for these things? How do we find out if our application is accessible? How can we assure it's compliant or working with the ADA, which is, even if you're not in the US, a good guideline for accessibility? How do you know if your audience has accessibility needs? Again, fun fact, you probably already have someone who is using your application who has accessibility needs. Before I get into the list of tools, let me just say this list is not exhaustive. It is not everything you can use, and not everything I say will work for your team. Find the tools that work for you and incorporate them into your organization. But these are some good ones. The first one is called the Accessibility Engine, or ACE. It tests out any HTML document to find potential issues with accessibility. It gives you a score based on how well you're complying with ADA guidelines, which again, I know you're not in the US, but you probably have users in the US. It's still a good guideline. The great thing about ACE is it actually has browser extensions that you can use in Chrome and Firefox. If you're using Microsoft Edge, first of all, I'm so sorry. I didn't make that, but I'm so sorry. But still, we're talking about accessibility, and there's still a lot of Windows users in there. You should probably be looking at it. You can still test your page out. It just doesn't have a browser extension. So Axe is great. There's another open source tool called, okay, so it's PA11Y, but it's pronounced Pally. And the reason why A11Y is because between the A and the Y in accessibility, there are 11 letters. So that's the hashtag you'll see online too. It's another tool that can bring attention to any accessibilities you have, visual or hearing-wise, lets you know what's going on. It's a script. You drop your URL, you run the script, drop your URL in, it runs the check, you get a report, and then you can sort from there what kind of action you want to take, decisions you want to make. There's also JAWS, which I've mentioned before. JAWS stands for Job Access with Speech, and it is the most commonly used screen reader for the blind available. It's thorough. It covers all accessibility issues for the blind. JAWS, unlike the previously two tools, is not exactly free. There is a free developer version that you can get. I think it has a limited time or limited scope or something along those lines. But it helps you get started. And if you find that you're having more and more blind users, then you can look into investing because it's kind of an important thing. The interesting, it has a weird name, Jobs Access with Speech. And part of the reason why it's Job Access with Speech is because it was basically made so that blind people could apply for jobs on the web, like a monster.com kind of thing. That's how it's been around for a long time. It integrated with AOL when it initially came out. It's a really cool product. And if you ever want to get a sense of what your website is like for a blind person, run it through JAWS, cringe for a while, maybe cry a little bit, and then be like, we have work to do. For testing color blindness, TopTall has this awesome filter that allows you to enter any URL you'd like and see what it looks like to people with various types of color blindness. Because it's not just red-green color blindness is the most common one. That's why I mentioned it. But there are different versions of color blindness. There's gray-white color blindness and lots of different ways that it works. The key is when you see it, it really clarifies the issue. Like you really start to understand why this is important. If you go to your website and you're like, man, it's awesome, we got all these great colors and there's like flashy videos and stuff, and you go to TopTall and you're like, oh my God, it looks kind of like garbage and vomit pasted together on a poster board, you'll realize that accessibility is kind of important and you might want to look into that. The most important tool, though, is trying to understand the people who have the accessibility issue that you are building these things for. Representation in the process often makes all the difference between having a complete application that meets the needs and expectations of your users and missing a few key things because we don't think like the people who need these things. This is simpler than it seems. Do you want to test facial recognition like you're working on some facial recognition software? Here's a quick tip. Make sure your team is not exclusively white people. This has been in the news a lot lately. It should be pretty obvious, but unfortunately in a lot of tech, a lot of engineering teams are white guys with beards. And not only does it not recognize not white people, it doesn't recognize people without beards. Not everyone has a beard. They are luxurious, they're lovely, but it doesn't mean everyone can grow one. Want to find out if the video that you have running in your application is cool and the captions make sense? Find some deaf students. Every city has them. Deaf people are all over the world. Hand them a transcript to read through on exactly what the video is supposed to explain, exactly what the communicated idea in the video is. Have them read through it, word for word, what it is, in the language of your choice. Then have them watch the video with the captions and see if they say, oh, yeah, it's good, makes sense. You know, it goes together, fine. Or they're like, what is that? It's garbage. I don't understand it's not the same. Having these people work together is about making your application more accessible to everyone. We talk a lot in tech about diversity and inclusion, but we're always talking about things that don't have anything to do with accessibility. We're talking about everybody who is physically capable, everyone who can see, everyone who can hear, and we're not thinking about those people who aren't. So are we really diverse if they're not included in the conversation? So, kind of a summation. Alt tags all the time. Every image should have one. Label your form fields. Caption all your videos and turn that friggin' default sound off. Radio buttons need to have labels too. Make sure you're paying attention to your fonts. Know your audience is the biggest key. Use the tools you know are used by your end users. This is where JAWS kind of comes in. You know that something is good when it has 70 to 80% adoption in a community. JAWS is like 70 to 80, maybe even 90% in the blind community. You know that's a tool they're going to be using. Put that in your tool belt to test for it. Remember, like, not everything's going to be as clear to you because of what you've gone through. You need to be aware that there's people with other issues, people that have things that they need to worry about. I added physically disabled to this list because it was funny. There's a big story about how there's this guy who is going to give a talk about the importance of accessibility in architecture. And he was the keynote speaker at this conference he was going to. Yeah, you know the story I'm talking about. And he got there and he rolled his wheelchair up and he's like, there's no ramp in this brand new building that was built like 6 months ago. I can't actually get in to give my talk about architecture like this. So yeah, think about what you're doing when you build things. If we can all give our end users a better experience, why wouldn't we? Like, isn't that kind of the goal? We've looked at ways to make things more accessible, many of which you do not add significantly to your coding cycle, your development cycle, and yet make our applications tremendously better for this little amount of effort that we're doing. It will be rough at first. It will take a little bit of time. But once you make it part of your natural development cycle, you'll find that, like, oh, yeah, so today, I'm just going to run through and check all the alt tags. You can write tests for these things. They can be found. It's very easy. It's not hard. The few easy steps, web and mobile worlds can make the world a better place for anybody, and that is really our goal. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions. Or if you don't have questions, that's cool too.
Do you have any strategy? Because do you have any strategies to put this awareness through the whole chain? Because we develop websites for customers, we get a design from someone, and very often we have a content management system, and we don't put the alt text there.
Right. So the question is, are there strategies for implementing this stuff, especially when you're working for outside customers, you have a content management system. You don't always have the option to do that. My suggestion would be to look into making people more aware, making people understand the importance of this. It's a growing movement. People are talking more and more. There's actually like strictly just accessibility web conferences now. So I think like putting it up the line, helping, we understand as developers, cool, now my manager needs to understand this. Now the product manager needs to understand this. Now the client needs to understand this because this is going to be a thing. And if your CMS is not automatically adding alt tags, get another CMS.
I'm actually working at this moment on an application for the Dutch government.
Okay.
And blind people have to be able to use it without help.
Yeah, see, so yeah, it's exactly like, it's very, like accessibility is very big in government agencies, and it's becoming more and more of a thing, especially, like, it's the government. Like, they kind of have to be available to absolutely everyone who lives in a country. And you can't be like, well, we only have like 1% of people who are sight impaired and 1% of people who are hearing impaired, so we're not going to worry about it. No, it doesn't work that way.
The only people that can't use it without help are the people that are mentally impaired.
Exactly. Mental impairment is a different issue, and that is one I'm not willing to get into because there's a lot going on there that I am not in any way an expert in.
But they are not legal to do it at their own anyways.
Right. So they should have someone assisting them. Just like having an interpreter or a translator, they should have someone helping them out. Yeah.
One question. You said you have to put before field labels to make it accessible, but today you see also a lot of websites using placeholders instead of labels. How is the speaking system for the accessibility is handling placeholders?
So the question is placeholders versus labels in form fields. A lot of times those placeholders are coming in through JavaScript or some other rendering portion of it. So the problem with it is a lot of times they don't have that alt tag. Like if I go to a place where there's a placeholder and I start typing first name, I start to type PJ in. I've already typed it. It's 2 letters. That placeholder is gone. A sight reader is not going to see a placeholder because it's not, for lack of a better term, it's not physically on the site. It's not an object. It's not really rendered. It's just kind of hanging out there until it's replaced by something. So a screen reader will miss it, and that's why a label is a much better way to do it. Yes.
Around the same subject, what about the ARIA label?
The
ARIA label.
ARIA label.
Yeah.
So the ARIA label is something that's new. I'm not really aware of how it works as far as screen readers go. I do know there's someone, a friend of mine online, his name is Adrian Roselli. And if you want to come up after it, I'm happy to give you his information on Twitter, who would definitely be able to answer that question more than I can. I know that it's become a bigger thing, and I feel like it's a positive thing from what I've read, but I'm not educated enough to give you a proper answer. I'll put it that way.
It also has properties like purpose and stuff. So not just a label, but it will also tell the screen reader what purpose it has.
Okay, so there you go. So it's not just a label; it also adds purpose to what that form field is doing. So maybe this is a much more positive thing, because I feel like purpose is definitely moving in the right direction. Anybody else?
Maybe on the screen reader, the label thing, you can set CSS to hide it for normal screens and set different style sheets to show the labels for screen reader. So you can still have your design placeholders for non-visually impaired, but use style sheets to hide them for non-visually impaired, but use the style sheets to show them for visually impaired. So you set up the labels.
Interesting. So to repeat, I'm supposed to repeat everything so it gets caught on the microphone. So the idea is you can set up your style sheets to have placeholders for non-screen readers, and then the screen readers can pick up through a different set of CSS directions that there are not placeholder, but form fields there. So the understanding can go either way based on how you're setting up your CSS. Which is funny, I was having a conversation before the talk about how we're also focused on frameworks and levels of abstraction and trying to get our applications built so fast that people have forgotten how to write HTML and CSS, and how if you're building a static website, it is perfectly fine to do that. You do not need a JavaScript framework to make a single page static website. It's not necessary. HTML and CSS do a great job. That's why they're still around.
I have a thought. I'm getting older. Miles are getting worse. I've just switched to reading glasses, and I get the fuck annoyed at sites that use these little teeny tiny fonts.
Oh yeah.
If you zoom in, it breaks the layout. Everything drops. It's annoying.
Right, and that's the whole accessible layout. Like especially with looking at a website on a mobile device versus looking at a website on a machine like this, and not having the ability to like see, and you stretch it out, and like the images are all pixelated and the writing is all pixelated, and you're not picking up any of the information. There's a very easy way using vector graphics and different things to make your information more clear. Like this kind of goes back to the HTML CSS thing too. If you're rendering like basically paragraphs, like why there's no need to like dynamically generate text. Like you can just style it. And if you just style it, it will be accessible. You'll be able to pinch zoom out or pinch zoom in so you can see the specific text. But the problem is everyone's doing this with some sort of JavaScript tie-in that then might not be accessible, and you're getting your pixelated letters, or you're not seeing anything at all, and it's useless. So yeah, like that's something to be aware of. Like it goes back to testing it a lot. Like a lot of people say, oh well, I built my web application, I looked at it in Chrome and Firefox, good to go. Send it out the door. No, your QA people should probably pick up a mobile device and look at your website. A perfect example, I was having dinner with my wife, who also works at DevRelate with me, and she was like, for some reason on mobile, your contact information doesn't show up. Like there's a little box at the bottom, contact us if you're interested. And it doesn't show up on mobile. And I was like, okay, well that needs to be fixed right away. And that's on me. I didn't check it. I very much don't test my code, but don't tell anybody I said that. Can we erase that part of the recording, please? Yeah, like it's something so simple, but like I just never scrolled all the way to the bottom and saw that it wasn't there. But at the same time, one of the things that I did do was like I blew it up, shrunk it down, see can I still read my site? Is the text still there? And it all renders properly. And these are simple tests. Like how long did it take her to do that? Probably a minute. So it's not like she deeply broke into the development cycle of the website for my company. Like it was like, hey, and if you see things like that, you should report it and let them know, because the only way we're going to know we have accessibility issues is if someone tells us. We can test as much as we want, but sometimes you're not going to get everything. None of us are making perfect software. If we were, none of us would have jobs. Thank you very much for having me, and I appreciate you coming.